Ethan Walker pressed 2 fingers against the bruise on her cheekbone, the one shaped exactly like a man's thumb, and felt something crack open inside his chest that he hadn't let breathe in 15 years. She flinched. Even unconscious, she flinched. He pulled his hand back and sat there in the firelight, staring at the fingerprints pressed into her skin like a brand, like a signature, like a man who had never once been told no and wanted to make sure she never forgot it. Ethan had stayed silent his whole life. He decided right then that silence was finished. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about justice, courage, and what one man's quiet action can do to a town that chose to look the other way. She came out of the dark like something the mountain had swallowed and decided to give back. Ethan Walker heard the horse before he saw it. A desperate, broken rhythm in the hoofbeats. Not the steady cadence of a rider who knew where she was going, but the panicked stumbling of an animal being pushed past its limit by someone who had no other choice. He set down the tin cup he'd been holding and stood from his chair without hurrying, because men who hurried in the mountains usually ended up dead or foolish, and he'd spent 15 years making sure he was neither. He opened the cabin door and held the lantern out into the darkness. The horse nearly collapsed the edge of the firelight. And on its back, slumped forward with both hands tangled in the mane, like she'd decided that was the only thing worth holding on to, was a woman. Ethan stepped off the porch. He moved slow and steady, the way he moved around spooked animals, because something in the way she was breathing told him that fast movements were going to be a problem. He caught the horse's bridle with one hand and looked up at her face, and that was when the lantern light caught the bruises. He went very still. He'd seen bruises before. A man didn't live 42 years in Montana territory without seeing what violence left behind on a body. But these were particular. These were deliberate. The kind of marks that didn't come from a fall or an accident, or even a single moment of cruelty. These were the marks of a man who had taken his time. There were fingerprints on her jaw. An almost perfect handprint wrapped around her left wrist where someone had gripped and twisted. Older bruising along her collarbone, yellowing at the edges, which meant this was not the first time and was not the first week. "Hey," he said very quietly. "Hey, I got you." She didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was shallow and ragged, and when he reached up and put his arms around her to lift her down from the saddle, she made a sound, not a word, just a sound, that hit him somewhere behind the sternum and stayed there. He carried her inside. She was lighter than she should have been for a grown woman, and Ethan noticed that the way you notice a wrongness in the world, a thing that shouldn't be and yet is. He laid her down on the bed near the fire and pulled the blanket over her, and then stood back and looked at her properly for the first time. She was young, mid-20s maybe. Dark hair loose around her face. Her dress was torn at the sleeve and there was dried blood on the fabric near her shoulder. Her hands, even slack in unconsciousness, were the hands of someone who worked. Rough palms, short nails, calluses in the right places. And the bruises. Everywhere he looked, there were bruises. Ethan pulled a chair to the bedside, and he sat, and he waited. He'd learned patience on this mountain the hard way. You didn't rush a wounded thing. You just stayed close enough that it knew it wasn't alone. She woke an hour later, and the first thing she did was grab the edge of the blanket and pull it up to her chin and scramble backward against the headboard with a sound like a cornered cat. "Easy," Ethan said. He didn't stand. He didn't move. He just kept his voice low and level, and his hands where she could see them, open on his knees. "Easy. You're safe. Nobody's here but me, and I ain't going to hurt you." Her eyes were wild, and she was breathing too fast, scanning the room, cataloging exits, doing the mental arithmetic of escape that a person only learned after they'd needed it enough times. "Where?" Her voice came out cracked and dry. She swallowed. "Where am I?" "About 4 miles above the valley. My cabin. You rode up here last night." He paused. "Your horse is in my barn. She's all right." Something in her face shifted at that. At the horse being all right. like that was the one piece of information that could get through the fear. Her breathing slowed by a fraction. I didn't... She stopped, started again. I didn't know where I was going. No, Ethan said. I don't reckon you did. She looked at him then, really looked at him, taking in the size of him. 6 feet 5 inches of broad shoulders and rough hands and a beard that had never once been fashionable. And he watched her make the calculation that women made when they found themselves alone with a large man, watched her measure the distance to the door, and then look at the door, and then look back at him. I'm not going to stop you if you want to leave, he said. That's your choice. Always been your choice. But it's cold out there tonight, and your horse is still tired, and I've got venison stew on the fire, and I haven't spoken to another human being in 3 weeks, so you'd also be doing me a kindness by staying. It wasn't entirely true. The 3 weeks part was an exaggeration by about a week. But he'd found over the years that honesty and humor, offered gently enough, could sometimes reach a person that nothing else could. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, the white-knuckled grip on the blanket loosened, just slightly. What's your name? She asked. Ethan Walker. A pause. Clara, she said. Clara Whitfield. Miss Whitfield. He stood, slow and deliberate, and moved to the fire to ladle stew into a bowl. Are you hungry? She was. She ate like someone who wasn't sure when the next meal was coming, which told him something, and she watched him the whole time with those careful eyes, waiting for him to become what she'd been running from. He gave her no reason to. He sat back in his chair and drank his coffee and didn't ask a single question, because he understood that some stories needed to find their own time. When she'd finished, she set the bowl down and folded her hands in her lap and stared at them. You're not going to ask me anything? She said. Not tonight. Most people would want to know. Most people ask questions for their own sake, Ethan said. When you're ready to talk, you'll talk. Ain't no reason to hurry that. She was quiet for a moment. Then, he's going to come looking for me. Ethan set down his coffee cup. Who is? Her jaw tightened. Nathaniel Crow. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan knew the name. Everyone in the Bitterroot Valley knew the name Nathaniel Crow. Crow owned the largest ranch in Red Hollow, 12,000 acres, a timber operation, a general store, and somewhere along the way, he'd managed to purchase the loyalty of the county sheriff, a man named Briggs, whose backbone had apparently been available at a reasonable price. Crow was the kind of man who had never once been told that there were things he couldn't have, and the absence of that word had calcified into something ugly over 50 years of getting whatever he reached for. You worked for him, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. I cooked for him. Clara's voice was flat. For 2 years, I cooked for his household. 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. She stopped. Her throat moved. I was good at my work. I was proud of it. And he decided that meant I was his. Her eyes came up and met Ethan's, and there was something in them that had burned past fear into something colder and harder. I told him no. The first time I told him no. The second time. She touched the fingerprint bruise on her jaw without seeming to realize she was doing it. By the third time, he'd stopped asking. The fire crackled between them. Ethan felt the old familiar cold settle into his chest. Not anger, not exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous than anger. Something that lived underneath anger and only showed itself when it had something specific to do. How long? He asked. 6 months. The words came out barely above a whisper. I kept thinking it would stop. I kept thinking if I just did everything right, kept my head down, didn't give him reason to... She shook her head. I told myself stories. Women tell themselves stories because the alternative is too frightening. And what changed? Clara was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was steady, in the way that things are steady when they've been broken and set and healed at an angle. He came to my room 3 nights ago, and afterward, while I was sitting on the floor, I looked at my own hands and I didn't recognize them. I thought, if I stay 1 more day, I am going to disappear. There won't be anything left of me that I recognize." She exhaled. "So I took his horse, the fastest one, because I figured if I was stealing from him, I might as well steal right. And I rode." "Where were you headed?" "Anywhere he wasn't." A pause. "I passed through town first. I went to the sheriff." Ethan didn't say anything, but something in his expression must have shifted, because Clara let out a short, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He told me to go home. He said—" She pressed her lips together. "He said Mr. Crow was a fine and upstanding man of the community, and that women in domestic service sometimes developed troublesome ideas, and that the best thing I could do was go back and apologize and not make any more trouble." "Briggs," Ethan said. "Briggs," she nodded. "He's owned. Everybody in Red Hollow knows it. Everybody in Red Hollow knows what Crow is, and they all just—" Her voice cracked, just slightly. "They all just look away." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. He thought about the mountain and the silence and the 15 years he'd spent up here, telling himself that what happened in the valley was not his problem, that he'd done his time tangled up in other people's wrongs, and it hadn't ended well for anyone, that a man was entitled to his peace. He thought about Clara Whitfield's hands, which didn't look like her own hands to her anymore. "You'll stay here tonight," he said finally. "And tomorrow, and however long you need. Crow's men don't come up this high. They think the mountain's haunted, which suits me fine." He stood and picked up the bowls and moved toward the wash basin. "There's a bolt on the inside of that door. You use it if it helps you sleep." He heard her exhale behind him, a long, slow exhale, like something being carefully let down from a great height. "Mr. Walker." "Ethan. Ethan." A pause. "Why are you helping me?" He stood there with his back to her, his hands in the wash basin, and considered the question the way he considered most questions, slowly, because he believed that honest answers deserved the time it took to find them. "Because you knocked on my door," he said. "And that took more courage than most men I've known ever showed in their whole lives. Seemed wrong not to answer it." She didn't say anything else, and after a while, when he turned around, she had lain back against the pillow with the blanket pulled up to her shoulder, and her eyes were closed, and she was asleep. He sat back down in his chair by the fire and stayed awake most of the night, not because he thought anyone would come, but because somebody needed to keep watch, and he'd found over the years that there was a certain kind of rest that didn't require sleep at all, the kind that came from being exactly where you were supposed to be. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and found him at the table cleaning his rifle with the methodical attention of a man who had learned that tools respected were tools that worked. "Good morning," she said from the doorway, and her voice was careful, like she was testing whether the kindness of the night before had limits that daylight would reveal. "Morning." He nodded toward the stove. "Eat something." She moved to the stove and poured herself coffee and stood at the window and looked out at the mountain, at the pines and the gray morning sky and the valley far below, and she was quiet for a long time. "He's going to send riders," she said. "Today, probably. He'll tell them I stole something. That's what he does. If a woman runs, he accuses her of theft, so there's a legal justification to bring her back." "He can accuse whatever he likes," Ethan said, without looking up from the rifle. "Ain't nobody coming up this mountain without my knowing about it, and they sure ain't taking you anywhere you don't choose to go." Clara turned from the window and looked at him. "You don't know what he's capable of." Ethan finally looked up. His eyes were steady and gray and completely without fear, and he held her gaze for a long moment before he spoke. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Clara, I appreciate the warning. I want you to know I'm taking it seriously." He set the rifle down on the table. "But I need you to understand something about me. I spent 15 years on this mountain convincing myself that staying out of things was wisdom. I watched plenty of wrong happen in the valley below, and I told myself it wasn't my place." He paused. "Woke up one morning not too long ago and realized I'd confused cowardice with philosophy." Clara stared at him. "Nathaniel Crow can send whoever he wants," Ethan said. "But he made a mistake when he put his hands on you, and he made another mistake when you ended up on my doorstep." He picked the rifle back up and turned to cleaning it, his movements calm and unhurried. I aim to make sure he understands both of those errors in some detail." The mountain was quiet around them. Somewhere outside, a hawk circled in the gray morning air, its shadow crossing the window and passing. Clara Whitfield sat down at the table across from him, wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like she was about to disappear. She felt instead like something that had been stopped, like a river that had been dammed for a very long time, was very slowly beginning to move again. She didn't have words for it yet, but sitting in Ethan Walker's cabin, with the mountain wrapped around them and the fire burning steady, and a man across the table who looked at the bruises on her face and saw a person instead of a problem to be managed, she felt the first fragile edge of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 6 months. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. 3 days passed. Ethan gave her space and gave her time, and she gave him the story in pieces, the way you pull a splinter out, a little at a time, because all at once is too much to bear. She told him about arriving at the Crow Ranch 2 years prior, a widow's daughter with a dead father's debts and a letter of recommendation from a Methodist minister who'd taught her to cook. She told him about the first months, which had been ordinary enough. Crow distant and businesslike, the other household staff careful and quiet, the work hard but honest. She told him about the evening 6 months ago when Crow had come to find her alone in the kitchen after supper, and how the look on his face had been something she recognized immediately, and had been dreading without knowing she was dreading it. The way you dread a storm, you can smell coming before you can see it. She told him about Rebecca Marsh, who had worked at the ranch before her and left suddenly 2 years prior. About Mary Ann Tillotson, the seamstress in town, who had a scar on her forearm she'd gotten from a man she refused to name, and a habit of lowering her eyes whenever Crow's name was mentioned. About the pattern that became visible once you knew to look for it. The way a man like Crow moved through a community, leaving evidence of himself on people who were never going to say a word, because the price of saying a word was everything they had left. Ethan listened to all of it. On the 4th day, he rode down to the edge of town. He didn't go in, not yet. He just sat on his horse on the ridge above Red Hollow and looked at it. The main street, the general store that had Crow's name above the door, the sheriff's office where Briggs was currently doing approximately nothing of value, the church, the houses, the ordinary face of a town that had decided its own comfort was worth more than its conscience. He sat there for a long time. Then he turned his horse around and rode back up the mountain. When he walked into the cabin, Clara was at the table mending the torn sleeve of her dress with the needle and thread she'd found in his supply cabinet, because Clara Whitfield was a woman who, even in the midst of catastrophe, could not sit still with a thing that needed fixing. She looked up when he came in. "Well," she said. Ethan took off his hat and hung it on the peg by the door. He poured himself a coffee and stood by the fire and stared into it for a moment, working something through in his head. "Tell me about the evidence," he said. "Not what he did to you. I believe that without proof. I'm asking, is there anything? Letters? Records? Witnesses who might, given the right circumstances, find their nerve?" Clara set the mending down slowly. "Rebecca Marsh," she said. "She left town, but I know where she went. Her sister lives in Missoula, and there was a bookkeeper, a man named Aldous Fenn, who kept Crow's household accounts. He was let go 6 months ago. I always wondered if he saw something he wasn't supposed to see." Ethan nodded. "There's also a ledger," Clara said, "in Crow's study. I saw it once. He left it open by accident, and I saw it before I understood what I was looking at. There were payments listed to Briggs. Not wages. Payments. Monthly. Going back years. Different column from the ranch payroll." Ethan went very still. "You're sure?" "I can remember numbers," Clara said quietly. "It's one of the things I've always been able to do. I remember what I see. I saw that ledger for maybe 30 seconds, and I could write it out for you right now, every figure on every line." He looked at her across the cabin, this woman with the yellowing bruises and the careful eyes and the needle and thread in her hands. And he thought that Nathaniel Crow had made the worst possible kind of mistake, the kind where you underestimate something you think you've broken. "All right," Ethan said. "All right what?" He set his coffee cup down and turned to face her fully. "All right, Clara. Here's what we're going to do." She looked at him and waited. "I'm going to ride to Missoula," he said. "You're going to write me down everything you remember from that ledger, every figure, every date, every name. And then we're going to find Aldous Fenn, and we're going to find Rebecca Marsh, and we're going to take everything they know, and everything you know, and everything I can find, and we're going to lay it out in front of every honest person left in Red Hollow until there's nobody left who can pretend they don't see it." Clara stared at him. "That's your plan?" she said. "That's the beginning of the plan. He has the sheriff. He has Briggs. Briggs ain't the only law in Montana Territory." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Why are you doing this?" Ethan was quiet too, for a beat. When he answered, his voice was simple and direct, the voice of a man who had stopped decorating his words. "Because it's right," he said. "Because somebody should. Because 15 years of staying out of it didn't make me peaceful. It just made me someone who was used to living with things he shouldn't have to live with." He picked up his hat from the peg. "And because you sat at my table 3 mornings running and apologized for things that weren't your fault, and I am about done watching good people apologize for surviving." Clara Whitfield looked at Ethan Walker for a long moment. Then she picked up the needle and thread and went back to mending her sleeve. But her hands, he noticed, were steady. They hadn't been steady when she arrived. They shook when she picked up the coffee cup, and shook when she passed him the salt at supper, and shook when she thought he wasn't looking, and she touched the bruise on her jaw. But now, in this moment, they were steady. And Ethan Walker, who had lived alone on this mountain for 15 years and told himself that was enough, felt something shift in the chest he'd kept closed for just as long. Felt it shift and open, just a fraction, like a door that had been stuck and suddenly found the air was right for moving. He put on his hat. "Write down that ledger," he said. "Every number you can remember." "Every number," she agreed. He walked to the door. "Ethan." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "Not for riding to Missoula, for—" She paused, searching for the right words, and then seemed to find them. "For opening the door." He stood there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, and the morning light coming in around him, and the mountain stretching out behind, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the small human arrangements being made beneath it. "That part was easy," he said, and then he walked out into the morning, and Clara Whitfield sat at the table with the needle and thread and the memory of a ledger full of damning numbers, and she began to write. Ethan rode out before dawn. Clara heard him go. The soft thud of boots on the porch, the creak of the barn door, the muffled sound of a horse being saddled with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times in the dark. She lay still in this bed and listened until the hoofbeats faded down the mountain trail. And then she lay there a little longer, staring at the ceiling of a stranger's cabin, thinking about the fact that she had handed her survival to a man she had known for 4 days. She thought about that for exactly as long as she could afford to think about it. Then she got up, built the fire back up from the coals, put the coffee on, and picked up the sheet of paper she'd started the night before, the one with Crow's ledger numbers on it, and kept writing. She wrote for 2 hours, without stopping. Every figure she could pull from the back of her mind, every date, every name in the margins that she hadn't understood at the time and understood perfectly well now. Her handwriting was precise and small, the handwriting of a woman who had taught herself to read and write from borrowed books because nobody had offered her the lessons, and she covered both sides of 3 sheets of paper before her hand began to ache and she stopped and flexed her fingers and looked at what she'd produced. It was enough. She knew it was enough because she knew numbers the way some people knew faces. She never forgot them, never misremembered them, and what she'd seen in that ledger for 30 seconds was as clear in her mind as if she were looking at it right now. Payments to Briggs, monthly, for 6 years, not wages, not listed under ranch payroll, listed under a column that Crow had labeled, with the particular brazenness of a man who believed no one would ever look, as community relations. She set the pen down. She picked up her coffee cup with both hands and held it, and thought about what community relations looked like in Red Hollow. Briggs waving her away from the sheriff's office with his soft, dismissive hands, telling her that Mr. Crow was a fine and upstanding man. The way the townspeople looked past her in the street as she walked to the ranch in the mornings, like she was already slightly invisible, already beginning to not exist. The way Rebecca Marsh had left on a Tuesday without saying goodbye to anyone, and nobody in town had asked why. She thought about Mary Ann Tillotson, the seamstress with the scar on her forearm and the lowered eyes. She thought about how many women in this territory had sat in the same cold place she was sitting in right now, and had no mountain to ride to, and no stranger who opened the door. The thought made something harden in her chest. Not grief exactly. Something that had been grief once, and was changing into something else. Something with more edges to it. Something that could be aimed. She was still sitting with that thought when she heard the hoofbeats. Not one horse. 3. Her body knew before her mind did. She was on her feet and across the cabin before she'd consciously decided to move, her hand finding the bolt on the door and throwing it, pressing her back against the wall beside the window and angling herself so she could see out without being seen. 3 riders on the trail below the cabin. Coming up slow, the way men came up when they were watching and measuring and hadn't decided yet whether they were going to be polite about what they were there to do. She recognized the man in front, Cole Hatchett, Crow's foreman, a tall man with a flat face and small, careful eyes who had worked for Crow for 12 years and had, in Clara's experience, never once demonstrated an original thought, only the borrowed authority of a man who stood close enough to power that some of it rubbed off on him. Behind him were 2 ranch hands she knew by sight, but not by name. Young men. The kind of young men who did what they were told, because it was easier than deciding what they believed. She made herself breathe. Ethan had said they wouldn't come up this high. He'd been wrong. Hatchett pulled up outside the cabin and looked at the smoke coming from the chimney and called out, "Hello, the cabin," in the particular tone of a man who was performing politeness rather than feeling it. Clara didn't answer. She looked around this cabin fast and deliberate. The rifle was gone. Ethan had taken it. There was a hunting knife on the shelf above the fireplace, an axe beside the wood pile, a cast-iron skillet on the stove that she'd used to make eggs an hour ago, and that weighed, she estimated, about 7 pounds. She picked up the skillet. "We know somebody's home," Hatchett called. "Smoke's coming out the chimney. We just want to talk." Men who wanted to talk did not ride up a mountain in the dark before sunup, she thought. Men who wanted to talk did not send 3 of themselves. She crossed to the fireplace and took the hunting knife from the shelf and tucked it into the waistband at the small of her back, then returned to the wall beside the door with the skillet in her right hand, and she waited. There was a long silence. She heard the horses shifting, heard one of the young men say something quietly, and Hatchett shush him. Then the sound of boots hitting the ground. Then footsteps on the porch. "Miss Whitfield." Hatchett's voice was right outside the door now, and he'd dropped the polite tone. "Mr. Crow wants you to come home. He's worried about you, concerned for your welfare." A pause. "You left in a state of some distress. He just wants to make sure you're all right." Clara felt her jaw tighten so hard her back teeth ached. She said nothing. "Look now," Hatchett said, and his voice shifted again, still controlled, but with something moving underneath it now, like a current below still water. "Nobody has to make this difficult. You come with us, nice and quiet. We'll say no more about the horse. Mr. Crow's a generous man. He's willing to overlook—" "He put his hands on me." Her own voice surprised her. It came out flat and clear and not shaking at all, which she hadn't expected, and for a second, she almost couldn't believe it had come from her own throat. Silence on the porch. "Miss Whitfield, he put his hands on me," she said again, louder. "And I am not going back. Not today and not ever. And if you try to come through that door, I promise you I will make it the worst decision you have ever made in your life. And I am holding something heavy when I say it, so I want you to take me seriously." Another silence. Longer this time. Then she heard one of the young men behind Hatchett say, under his breath, "She sounds serious, Cole." And Hatchett said, low and mean, "Shut your mouth." The door handle rattled. Clara raised the skillet. The door shuddered in the frame. Not a knock, a test, someone checking how solid the bolt was. And Clara took a breath and set her feet and thought, clearly and without panic, "All right. All right then." The door shuddered again, harder. And then, from somewhere down the trail, came a voice that carried up the mountain like a crack of thunder in still air. "I'd think very carefully about what you're doing." The rattling stopped. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She heard the horses below react. A startled shuffle, the sound of a bit being pulled, and then boots on the trail. And then Ethan Walker came around the side of the cabin on foot, which meant he'd left his horse lower down and walked up quiet. And he was carrying the rifle in a way that wasn't threatening, exactly, but wasn't not threatening either. I was looking at Cole Hatchett with the particular calm expression of a man who is not angry, which is, Clara had come to understand in the past 4 days, significantly more frightening than a man who is. Hatchett turned slowly. The 2 ranch hands on horseback below had both gone very still. "Walker," Hatchett said. His voice was careful now, the bluster drained out of it. "Hatchett." Ethan stopped about 10 feet away and looked at the 3 of them, taking his time. "You're on my land. We're looking for—" "I know what you're looking for. She already told you she's not going. I heard her from down the trail." He tilted his head just slightly. "Girl's got good lungs." Hatchett's expression flickered. Mr. Crow, Ethan said, "is not here. You are. And you're on my land." He said it a 3rd time, simple as stating weather. "So, I'm going to ask you once, politely, to turn those horses around and ride back down to the valley and tell Crow that Miss Whitfield is not available." Hatchett looked at him for a long moment. Clara watched through the window, her grip tight on the skillet, watching Hatchett calculate. The size of Ethan, the rifle, the 3 of them against one of him, the particular quality of Ethan's stillness, which was not the stillness of a man who was afraid. "You're making an enemy," Hatchett said. "I've had worse ones," Ethan said pleasantly. "Ride on, Cole." The moment stretched out. Then Hatchett turned and walked back to his horse and swung up into the saddle, and the 3 of them turned and rode back down the mountain trail without another word, and Ethan stood and watched them go until they were out of sight. Then he walked to the cabin door and knocked twice, lightly. "It's me." Clara threw the bolt and opened the door and stood there with the skillet still in her hand and looked at him. He looked at the skillet. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Were you going to hit him with that?" he said. "I was considering it." "Good instinct." He stepped inside, leaned this rifle against the wall. "You all right?" "I'm fine." She set the skillet down on the table with a thunk that was perhaps harder than necessary. "You said they wouldn't come up this high." "I was wrong." "You were wrong." "I said so." He looked at her steadily. "It won't happen again. I'll put some discouragement along the lower trail." He paused. "You talked back to Hatchett?" "I did." "Good." He said it simply, without ceremony, and picked up the coffee she'd left on the stove. "I rode to the Pembroke farm on the way down. Elias Pembroke. You know him?" Clara thought. "The wheat farmer, east side of the valley. His daughter used to work at the Crow Ranch," Ethan said. 3 years ago. She came home with a broken wrist that Crow explained as a fall from a horse, and Elias Pembroke has been quietly furious about it ever since. But he's one man with 400 acres of wheat and no allies, and he knew it. He set the coffee cup down. "He's an ally now." Clara stared at him. "You did that this morning." "It didn't take long. Man's been waiting for someone to ask." Ethan pulled out the chair and sat down across from the table from her. "He also told me about a woman named Dora Selby, runs the laundry in town. Apparently she knows things, and she's been keeping them to herself because nobody offered her a reason not to." He paused. "I think we need to talk to her." "Crow will know," Clara said. "The moment you start talking to people in town, he'll know." "Yes." "And then he'll do what men like him always do," Ethan said. "He'll threaten and bluster and try to make the problem go away by making the people smaller. Same as always." He looked at her. "Only this time the people aren't going to get smaller." Clara sat down. She looked at the papers on the table. the ledger numbers she'd spent 2 hours writing down. She slid them across to him. He picked them up and read. His expression didn't change, but something in the way he held the papers shifted. A slight tightening of the hands, a careful quality coming into his attention that hadn't been there before. "Payments to Briggs," he said. 6 years, every month, under community relations. Ethan set the papers down very carefully, the way you set down something that might break if you aren't deliberate about it. "You remember all of this," he said. "Every number." He looked at her for a moment. "Nathaniel Crowe is going to regret the day he let you anywhere near his study." Something moved through Clara that she didn't have an easy name for. It wasn't pride exactly. She hadn't done anything yet. It was more like the first intimation that she might be something other than a victim of this story. That she might be, instead, a participant in it. "What's the plan?" she said. "We need a judge," Ethan said. "Not Briggs, not anyone Crowe can reach. There's a circuit court judge named Harlan Pruitt who rides through the territory twice a year. He's due in Missoula in 3 weeks. He's known as an honest man. I've heard it from 3 separate sources who have no reason to lie. And in my experience, that's as close to certain as you get about a person's character. 3 weeks is a long time. It is. Which means we spend those 3 weeks building something he can't dismiss." Ethan spread his hands on the table, those large, scarred, capable hands. "We need Aldous Fenn. We need Rebecca Marsh. We need Elias Pembroke and Dora Selby, and however many other people we can find who've been carrying this quietly and just need someone to stand beside them when they put it down." Clara looked at him. "And me," she said. "You need me. You're the center of it. Your testimony, your memory of that ledger, that's the foundation." He met her eyes. "But only if you're willing. I won't push you into that room if you're not ready to be in it." "I'll be ready," she said. She said it before she'd finished deciding whether it was true, and then sat with it for a second, tested the edges of it, and found that it was true. "I'll be ready," he nodded. No ceremony, no congratulation, just a nod, and then he picked up his coffee and moved on, because that was how Ethan Walker handled most things, with a straightforwardness that, Clara was beginning to understand, was its own kind of respect. He didn't make a thing bigger than it needed to be. He just took it seriously and moved. "I'll ride to Missoula day after tomorrow," he said. "Look for Fenn. Find Rebecca Marsh's sister. See if she'll write to Rebecca and ask her to come." He paused. "You'll stay here. I'll have Elias Pembroke's oldest boy come up and stay within earshot, just in case." "I don't need a guard," Clara said. "No," he said, "you don't. But it'd make me feel better." She looked at him. He was looking at the papers again, running his finger down the column of numbers she'd written. And he said it the way someone said something true, without thinking about whether it was strategic to say it, just because it was true. She felt something move in her chest again, that fragile, careful something that she'd been trying not to examine too closely, because she didn't know yet whether she could trust it. "All right," she said. They spent the rest of the morning working. Ethan wrote letters, to Missoula, to the circuit court, one to a lawyer he knew in Helena, who had a reputation for taking cases that nobody else wanted. Clara read over his shoulder and caught 2 errors and rewrote 1 paragraph that she considered insufficiently specific about the nature of the evidence. He watched her fix it without comment, and then said, "You ever think about the law?" "Women aren't lawyers," she said. "Not yet," he said. She looked at him. He was folding the letter, not looking at her, his face entirely matter of fact. "Not yet," she repeated slowly. He sealed the letter. "Times change, always have." He handed the stack to her. "Which of those do you want to take to the post in Haverfield, and which should I take?" She sorted them by importance, and by whom Crowe would be less likely to think worth intercepting, and they divided them, and that was that. In the afternoon, a boy of about 17 arrived at the cabin, tall and angular, with Elias Pembroke's red hair and the uncomfortable bearing of someone who had been told to perform a task he considered beneath his abilities. "You're Miss Whitfield?" he said. "I am. Pa says to sit nearby and make myself useful." He looked around with the expressive skepticism of a teenager. "I'm Jeremiah." Jeremiah, Clara said. Can you cook? He blinked. Ma'am? Cook, food, on a fire. Are you able? Some, I reckon. Good. She handed him a bucket. Get water from the creek and peel those potatoes on the shelf, and I'll teach you to make a decent stew while Mr. Walker is out. Sitting nearby being useful should actually involve being useful, don't you think? Jeremiah Pembroke stared at her for a second with his mouth slightly open, and then, to his credit, he took the bucket. Ethan came back that evening to the smell of stew and the sight of a teenage boy being instructed, very precisely, in the correct way to cut a carrot. He stood in the doorway and watched this for a moment without announcing himself. Clara looked up. There's food. I can see that. He came inside and hung his hat. How'd the afternoon go? Jeremiah knows how to make stew now. She ladled a bowl and pushed it across the table toward him. He also knows how to make cornbread, and I started teaching him to read receipts because he told me he has trouble with numbers, and that's going to be a problem when he takes over the farm. Ethan sat down and looked at the stew and looked at Jeremiah, who was eating with the focused intensity of someone who had not realized he was hungry until food appeared. You taught the boy to read receipts. I was sitting here anyway. He picked up his spoon. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Dora Selby is willing to talk. Clara's hand stilled on the ladle. She came to find me, Ethan said, at Pembroke's farm. Said she'd heard I was asking around and she'd been waiting 12 years for someone to ask the right questions. He paused. She knows about 7 women. Names, dates, what happened to each of them. She's been keeping a record. The room was very quiet. Jeremiah, to his credit, had put down his spoon and was listening with the stillness of a young person who understood suddenly that they were in the presence of something serious. 12 years, Clara said. 12 years, she's been keeping that record. Ethan's voice was controlled. Writing it down in a notebook she keeps inside a hollowed-out Bible on her shelf because she figured Crow's men would never look too hard inside a Bible. Clara sat down. She sat down because her legs made the decision before she did. 7 women, she said, that she knows of. She put her hands flat on the table. She breathed. She thought about the moment 6 months ago when she'd first understood what was coming, the way the air in the room had changed, the way she'd stood in the kitchen and known and had nowhere to go with the knowing. She thought about 7 women who had no Ethan Walker's cabin to ride to in the dark. She thought about Dora Selby, sitting in her laundry for 12 years with a hollowed-out Bible, waiting. We need her testimony, Clara said. Her voice came out steady. She's willing to give it. All of it. In front of the judge, in front of the town. She said, and I'm quoting her, she said she'd been quiet long enough to last her 2 lifetimes, and she was damned. She used the word, I'm just reporting it. She was damned if she was going to die with it still in her. Clara let out a breath that shook at the edges, just at the edges. Okay, she said. Okay. Jeremiah Pembroke picked his spoon back up, very quietly, and went back to eating. He was old enough to understand that some moments needed to be held carefully, and that the appropriate response to them was not to make them bigger. That night, after the boy had bedded down in the barn with the horses, Clara sat by the fire, and Ethan sat across from her. And neither of them spoke for a long time, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had talked about enough difficult things that silence didn't require filling. You're going to have to testify, Ethan said eventually. I know. Not just to Pruitt. The town will be there. Crow will have men in the room. Briggs will try to undermine everything you say. He paused. It's going to be hard. Everything worth doing has been hard, Clara said. She wasn't performing bravery. She said it the way she'd say the temperature of water, as a fact about the world that she'd accepted enough times that it no longer required comment. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Where did you come from? He said. What do you mean? Before the Crow Ranch, before Red Hollow. Where did you come from? She was quiet for a second. Small town in the Dakotas. My father ran a mill. My mother died when I was 10, so I ran the house after that. My father and 3 younger brothers. Cooking, cleaning, keeping accounts, managing the business side when my father's health started to go. She looked at the fire. He died when I was 22. The mill went to my uncle because that's how things went. I had $20 and a letter from a Methodist minister, and I came west. A pause. I was not going to be a woman who had nothing and stayed that way. And then you ended up at Crow's. And then I ended up at Crow's, she agreed, which was supposed to be a stepping stone. I had a plan. Save enough money in 3 years to open a boarding house. I know how to run a household. I know how to manage accounts. I had a plan, and it was a good plan, and... She stopped. And someone decided your plan didn't matter as much as what he wanted. Yes. Ethan was quiet for a moment. The plan doesn't have to be dead, he said. Clara looked at him. After this, he said. After Pruitt and the testimony and all of it. You still know what you know. You still have the same abilities you walked into that ranch with. He didn't take those. He met her eyes. He hurt you. He took 6 months and a lot of peace of mind. But the plan, the boarding house, the life you were building toward, that's still there. She stared at him for a long moment. You're a strange man, Ethan Walker, she said. I've been told. Most men, they'd feel good about protecting me. They'd want that to be the story. Big man saves the woman. She tilted her head. You're more interested in the fact that I didn't need saving in the first place. You're more interested in what I had already built. He thought about it. You didn't need saving, he said. You needed someone to stand beside you while you fought for yourself. That's different. He paused. I was just the person who opened the door. She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight. Then she said, I think you've been alone up here too long. Probably. I think you convinced yourself you didn't need people. I did. And how's that going? The corner of his mouth moved, just barely, but it moved. Ask me again in 3 weeks, after the judge comes through. Clara smiled. The first real, full, unguarded smile she'd managed since she arrived. It changed her face completely, pulled the shadow out of it, and for a second she looked exactly like the woman she'd been before 6 months of Nathaniel Crow's particular cruelty had taught her to hold her expression in reserve. Ethan looked at that smile for just a second longer than he meant to. Then he looked back at the fire. Get some sleep, he said. Lot of work tomorrow. Yes, she agreed. She stood and stretched and moved toward the bedroom door, and then stopped. Ethan. The 7 women. Dora's list. She was quiet for a second. I keep thinking, if one of them had spoken, if just one of them, at the beginning, had had someone stand beside them. I know, he said. We stop it here, she said. Not a question, not a hope. A statement of fact, the way she stated numbers. We stop it here, he said. She nodded once and went to bed. Ethan sat by the fire for another hour, and he thought about a man in Red Hollow who had spent 12 years believing he owned a valley and everyone in it. And he thought about the look on Clara Whitfield's face when she said, we stop it here. And he thought about all the things a person could build when they finally decided that the time for staying quiet was finished. The fire burned down to coals. The mountain was silent around the cabin, and in the town below, Nathaniel Crow sat in his study and did not yet know that a woman with a perfect memory for numbers had spent 2 hours that morning writing down every figure in a ledger he had never imagined anyone would read. He was about to find out. Ethan left for Missoula 2 days later, before the sun was up. I didn't make a production of it. He packed what he needed into the saddlebag, checked the rifle, left enough firewood stacked on the porch to last a week, and knocked twice on the bedroom door to tell Clara he was going. She was already awake. He could tell by the quality of the silence on the other side of the door. The kind of silence a person makes when they're lying still, but not sleeping. I'll be back in 5 days, he said through the door. 6 at the outside. Jeremiah's in the barn. A pause. Then, be careful. Always am. You rode into 3 armed men 2 days ago without blinking. I said careful, didn't say timid. He picked up his saddlebag. Write down anything else you remember. Any detail, any name, anything at all. Small things matter. I know they do, she said. He left. The trail down the mountain was dark, and the horse moved carefully through it, picking its footing with the sureness of an animal that had made this particular descent enough times to have opinions about it. Ethan rode with his mind already working through the sequence of what needed doing. Find Aldous Fenn. Find Rebecca Marsh through her sister. Locate the circuit court clerk and file the formal request for Judge Pruitt's time. 3 tasks that sounded simple and were not, because nothing in this territory was simple when a man like Nathaniel Crow was the obstacle standing between the current reality and the one that ought to exist. He'd been riding about 2 hours when he came around a bend in the lower trail and found Cole Hatchett waiting for him. Not 3 men this time, just Hatchett, alone, sitting his horse sideways across the path with his hands visible and empty, which was either a gesture of peace or a very careful performance of one. Ethan pulled up and looked at him. Hatchett. Walker. Hatchett's flat face was doing something complicated that his face wasn't really built for. I want to talk. You're in my way. I know it, that's intentional. He didn't move his horse. 5 minutes, just talk. Ethan considered him for a long moment. Cole Hatchett was not a man he'd ever had reason to trust, but he was also not a stupid man, and a stupid man would not have ridden out here alone. Whatever this was, it was something Hatchett had decided to do without Crow's knowledge, and that was interesting enough to hear out. Talk, Ethan said. Hatchett looked at the trail ahead, and then back at Ethan, and something shifted in his expression, a peeling back of the foreman's bluster, revealing something underneath that looked, surprisingly, like a man who was tired. The girl who worked at the ranch before Miss Whitfield, Hatchett said. The cook. Her name was Alice Pryor. Ethan waited. She left in the winter of '82. Crow told everyone she went back east to her family. Hatchett's jaw worked for a second. She didn't go back east. I helped Crow pay her $300 to leave the territory and keep her mouth shut and never come back. He looked at Ethan directly. I knew what the money was for. I told myself it was just business, that it wasn't my place to... He stopped. To what? Ethan said. To say anything. The words came out flat and disgusted, and it took Ethan a second to realize the disgust was directed inward. I've been telling myself that for 4 years. It wasn't my place. It wasn't my business. I just worked there. Hatchett's hands tightened on his reins. Then Miss Whitfield came in to see Briggs, and Briggs sent her away, and I was standing right there in the office, and I watched him do it, and He stopped again, shook his head. I didn't say a word. The mountain was very quiet around them. Why are you telling me this now? Ethan said. Because you're going to Missoula, Hatchett said. Everybody in the valley knows it by now. News travels. And because I am telling you that I will testify. I will stand in front of whatever judge you put in front of me, and I will say what I just said to you, and I will say it in front of Nathaniel Crow if that's what it takes. He held Ethan's gaze. I'm not asking you to trust me. I know I don't have that coming. I'm just telling you what I'm willing to do. Ethan looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Alice Pryor, he said. Do you know where she went? Billings, last I heard. Her exact situation when she left. The amount paid, who arranged the transfer, who witnessed it. Can you write all of that down? Every detail. Then write it down and get it to Elias Pembroke's farm by the end of the week. Ethan gathered his reins. And Hatchett. Yeah. If this is Crow sending you to find out what I know, it's not. Then I want you to think carefully about what you're gambling, because I am not a man who bluffs, and I am not a man who forgets. Hatchett nodded slowly. It's not Crow, he said. It's 12 years too late, but it's not Crow. Ethan rode around him and continued down the trail toward Missoula. He didn't look back. But he filed the information away with the precision of a man who understood that every piece had its place, and that what looked like an unexpected edge could cut in either direction, depending on how it was held. Missoula was 3 days' ride, and Ethan made it in 2.5 by sleeping less than he should have and pushing the horse more than he liked to, but not more than the horse could handle, because there was a difference between demanding and abusing, and Ethan had always understood that distinction clearly. He found Aldous Fenn on the second afternoon. How was not hard to find. Fenn had a small, meticulous room above a printer's shop, and he earned his living now doing bookkeeping for several Missoula businesses, the kind of quiet, competent work that kept a man fed and anonymous. He was a small man in his 50s, with ink-stained fingers and the careful, watchful expression of someone who had spent a long time making himself as unnoticeable as possible. When Ethan knocked on his door and said Clara Whitfield's name, Fenn opened the door wide without another word and stepped back to let him in. "I wondered when someone would come," Fenn said. He was already moving to a trunk at the foot of his bed. "I wondered if anyone ever would." "What's in the trunk?" Ethan said. Fenn opened it and lifted out a folder, thick with papers. "I kept copies," he said simply. "When Crow dismissed me, I walked out of that house with copies of everything I'd ever entered into his books. Because I'm a careful man, Mr. Walker, and I had been watching Mr. Crow for 2 years, and I understood that careful men keep records." He held the folder out. "The payments to Briggs are in there, going back 9 years, not 6. And there are others. A land acquisition in '79 that involved a deed that was not, in my professional opinion, genuine. A payoff to a county assessor in '81. And there is a payment in the spring of '82 to a man named Ridley, who I believe provided certain services in convincing a ranch owner east of Red Hollow to sell land he had no intention of selling." Ethan took the folder and opened it and looked at the first page and felt the particular cold clarity that came over him sometimes when a thing he'd suspected was confirmed in black and white. "Will you come to Red Hollow?" he said. "In 3 weeks, to testify." Fenn looked at him steadily. "Mr. Walker, I left that county because I was afraid. I have been afraid since the day I walked out of Crow's house." He paused. "But I have also been unable to sleep a full night in 18 months. And I believe that the two facts are connected." He straightened. "Yes, I will come." Ethan found Rebecca Marsh the next morning. She was not in Missoula. Her sister was, a practical, broad-shouldered woman named Frances, who listened to Ethan's explanation with her arms folded and her jaw set, and then said, "Rebecca's in Helena. She's been in Helena for a year. She's doing well, and I am not going to let you undo that." "I'm not here to undo anything," Ethan said. "I'm here to give her the choice." "She made her choice. She left." "She left because she had no other option," Ethan said. "I'm offering her one, if she wants to put what happened to her on the record and have Crow answer for it in front of a judge. I will make sure she's safe and supported and that she never has to be alone in that room. If she doesn't want that, I will not ask again." He held the woman's gaze. "But I think she deserves to be asked." Frances looked at him for a long moment. Then she went inside and came back with a piece of paper and wrote an address in Helena. "You tell her I said she doesn't owe anybody anything," Frances said. "You make sure she hears that first." "I'll make sure," Ethan said. He was back on the mountain in 5 days, as promised. Clara met him at the door of the cabin before he'd fully dismounted, because she had heard the hoofbeats, and she was not a woman who waited inside when she could see what was coming from the doorway. She looked at the folder under his arm. "Fenn," she said. "Fenn." He handed it to her. "Look at page 3. She opened it and found page 3 and read it, and the color shifted in her face. Something going tight and then releasing. The expression of a person who has been told they were right about something they desperately wished they'd been wrong about. 9 years, she said. 9. He told me it was a legitimate business arrangement." She said it quietly, not explaining to Ethan, just saying it out loud, laying it down somewhere outside herself. "He told me Briggs was a personal friend, that the payments were. He said it was how things were done in a growing territory." She closed the folder. "I believed him for about a week, and then I looked at the numbers and I knew." "And you kept that knowledge. What was I going to do with it?" She looked up at him. "A woman alone in a man's house, with no allies, no money, nowhere to go. I kept it because it was the only thing I had that was mine." A pause. "Turns out it was worth keeping." Ethan looked at her for a moment. There was something different about her. Not dramatic, not a sudden transformation, but a quality of settledness that hadn't been there when he'd left. Like something had clarified while he was gone. "Hatchet," he said. "I know." She said it evenly. "Jeremiah told me he came to the farm while you were gone, that he brought a written statement to Pembroke." A pause. Do you trust him? Not entirely. But his information is verifiable, and his reasons are his own problem. Ethan came inside and hung his coat. What happened here while I was gone? 3 things, Clara said. She sat down at the table with the folder, and Ethan sat across from her. First, Dora Selby came up the mountain. She didn't send word, she just came. Rode up alone on a mule that looked about as old as the territory. Something moved across Clara's face. Respect, or the beginning of it. She brought the Bible. The notebook. The notebook. 7 women, 7 separate accounts, dates and descriptions, and, in 2 cases, names of people who witnessed some part of what happened. Clara looked at the table for a second. She was shaking when she got here. Not because she was afraid, because she'd been carrying it so long that putting it down was... It was a physical thing. She sat at this table and put the Bible on it, and took her hands off it, and then just sat there for a minute. Ethan was quiet. She said to tell you that she'll be there, Clara continued. She said she has already lived the worst of it, so the courtroom can't be any worse. She paused. She also made biscuits while she was here, because she said she needed to do something with her hands. You said 3 things. Second thing. Clara's expression shifted, and Ethan recognized the quality of the shift. A careful neutrality, the kind that covered something that mattered. Crow came to the edge of the lower trail. Ethan went very still. Not past the trail marker, not onto your land. She was watching him with those careful eyes. He sat on his horse at the edge of the property line, and he waited until Jeremiah came out of the barn, and he gave Jeremiah a message to give to me. What message? Clara reached into her apron pocket and set a folded piece of paper on the table between them. Ethan picked it up and unfolded it and read. It was written in a fine, practiced hand, the handwriting of a man who had spent 50 years being important. Miss Whitfield, I am saddened by the misunderstanding that has developed between us. I believe that with calm reflection, you will see that the arrangement we had was mutually beneficial, and that certain aspects of your current situation, your dependence on a man you barely know, your isolation in the mountains, the uncertainty of your future, might benefit from reconsideration. I am a generous man to those who choose generosity in return. My door remains open. N. Crow. Ethan set the letter down. Mutually beneficial, Clara said. Her voice was completely flat. He's afraid, Ethan said. I know he is. She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. I'm keeping it. It's evidence that he knows I'm here, and that he's attempting to influence my testimony before I've even formally given any. She looked at Ethan. I've been thinking about the law while you were gone, about what constitutes evidence and what constitutes witness intimidation. Ethan stared at her. I found a book on your shelf, she said, just slightly defensive. You have a lot of books for a man who claims to live alone. I didn't claim anything. It was a legal text, published in '74. It's outdated, but the principles hold. She met his eyes. He made a mistake, coming to the edge of your property and sending that letter. He wanted to scare me quietly. Instead, he left a paper trail. Ethan looked at the woman across the table from him. This woman with the healing bruises and the precise handwriting and the legal text she'd apparently consumed while he was gone, and felt something move through him that was warm and sure and entirely inconvenient. He looked back at the folder. What was the third thing? He said. Clara was quiet for a second. When she spoke, her voice was measured. Rebecca Marsh wrote to her sister. Frances forwarded the letter here. I think she wasn't sure how to reach you in Missoula. She set a separate envelope on the table. She's coming. Rebecca Marsh is coming. Ethan looked up. She's coming to testify, Clara said. She said she has a daughter now, a little girl, 2 years old. And she said she doesn't want her daughter to grow up in a world where men like Crow just keep going. Her voice steadied on the last words. The way you steady something precious you're carrying. She said her daughter's name is Alice. The name hit the room like a dropped stone. Alice Pryor. The woman before Clara. The woman Hatchet had helped pay off and ship out of the territory in the winter of '82. Rebecca Marsh had named her daughter after the woman who came before her. Ethan sat with that for a moment. Just sat with it, because some things deserved a moment before you moved past them. "All right," he said finally. "All right," Clara agreed. They spent the next week working. It was the most sustained collaboration Ethan had experienced since before the mountain, and it was, he found, with some surprise, not uncomfortable. Clara was precise and tireless, and occasionally infuriating in the way that very organized people were infuriating to people who were organized differently. But she was also right more often than she was wrong, and she had the rare quality of changing her position immediately when presented with better information, without making an argument out of the change. They divided the tasks between them. Ethan rode to town 3 times, and each time returned with something: a signed statement from Elias Pembroke, a name from Dora Selby's list, who had agreed to speak, a piece of information from a man who worked at the county assessor's office and had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Clara organized everything. She created a system, dates, cross-references, chains of evidence, on the table of the cabin, covering the surface with papers arranged in a logic that made sense only to her at first, and then, when she explained it to Ethan, made perfect and obvious sense. She also wrote out her own testimony. 3 drafts, each one cleaner and more precise than the last. On the 4th draft, her hand shook. Ethan noticed because he was across the table, and he noticed most things. He didn't comment on it. He just stood, went to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee, and put one in front of her. "Thank you," she said. She picked up the pen again. The shaking stopped. That was the rhythm of it. Neither of them making the difficulty bigger than it was. Neither of them pretending it wasn't there. On the 8th day, Crow made his next move. Ethan was in town, the general store, picking up supplies, making himself visible because visibility at this point was itself a strategy, when Sheriff Briggs found him. Briggs was a wide man with a soft voice and the practiced ease of someone who had spent years making injustice comfortable. He came up beside Ethan in the street and said, "Mr. Walker, I wonder if we might have a word." "Having one right now," Ethan said, without stopping. Briggs fell into step beside him. "I've been hearing some concerning things. Rumors about a campaign of harassment against one of our county's most respected citizens. I'd hate for a man of your reputation to get caught up in something that might not go the way he's expecting." Ethan stopped walking. He turned and looked at Briggs. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his expression. "Briggs," he said, "I know about the payments." Briggs's soft face went carefully blank. "Monthly," Ethan said. "For 9 years, under community relations." He watched something move behind Briggs's eyes. A fast, desperate calculation happening behind a composed face. "I know the amounts and the dates, and I have the documentation, which means that when Judge Pruitt comes through, you have a choice to make. You can be the man who stands beside Nathaniel Crow when this falls, or you can be the man who decided, at the last possible moment, that law enforcement meant something after all." He held the sheriff's gaze. "I'd suggest you don't take too long deciding." Briggs stared at him. "You can't prove," he started. "I can prove all of it," Ethan said simply. "Good afternoon, Sheriff." He turned and walked into the general store. Behind him, he heard Briggs stand in the street for a long moment, and then walk away in the other direction, and the direction he walked was toward Crow's land office, which was exactly what Ethan had expected. He needed Crow to know the scope of what was coming. He needed Crow frightened and reactive, because frightened reactive men made mistakes. Howe was back at the cabin by nightfall, and he had barely finished telling Clara what had happened when she said, "He'll go after the witnesses now." "Yes." "He'll try to buy them off first, then threaten them." "Yes." "We need them somewhere safe. Already arranged. Pembroke's farm has enough room. Dora Selby has already agreed to stay there with her sister starting the day before the hearing. Rebecca Marsh will come straight there from the stage." Ethan sat down and pulled off his boots. "Fenn is coming with a lawyer from Missoula. Man named Gareth Cole, who has argued in front of circuit courts before and won." Clara looked at the table full of organized papers. "We're ready," she said, like she was checking an accounting. Getting there. No. She looked up at him. We're ready. She paused. Are you? He looked at her. Ready for what? To walk into that town and do this in front of everyone. To let it be loud and public and... She searched for the word. Irreversible. Once we walk into that courthouse, Ethan, it's irreversible. It was irreversible when you knocked on my door, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. I want you to know something, she said. Her voice was careful, the way it was when she decided to say something true and was making sure to say it accurately. I have been afraid almost every day since I arrived here. Not of you. Of all of it. Of standing up and being the kind of woman who stands up, because those women don't always get to tell their own story afterward. Sometimes they just become warnings. I know, Ethan said, but I have also not been alone for a single day since I got here, she continued. And I need you to understand what that has meant. Not the rifle on the trail or the letters to Missoula. Just the door being open, the coffee on the stove, the fact that you looked at what he did to me and you were angry at him instead of ashamed of me. Her jaw tightened. Do you understand how rare that is? It shouldn't be rare, Ethan said. No, she agreed. It shouldn't. She picked up her pen and went back to work, and he sat across the table from her and read through Aldous Fenn's documents for the 4th time, looking for anything they might have missed. When it arrived in Red Hollow, Ethan sat alone on the porch and looked at the valley below. The lights of the town were small and distant. Somewhere down there, Nathaniel Crow was sitting in his house, and Ethan understood the precise shape of what Crow was feeling because he had seen it before, not in villains, but in ordinary men who had built their lives on the assumption that certain things would never be challenged. The panic that set in when you understood that the architecture of your life had been built on someone else's pain, and the bill was finally coming due. He heard the cabin door open behind him. Clara sat down on the porch step beside him. Not across from him, not at a respectful distance. Beside him, close enough that her shoulder was near his arm. Nervous? She said. No. Liar. He almost smiled. Maybe a little. She looked at the valley. He's going to try to discredit me, she said. In the courtroom. His lawyer will try to make me seem unstable or vindictive, or a woman who had an arrangement she later decided to regret. Yes, Ethan said. And you're going to sit in that chair, and you're going to remember every number from every document you've ever seen, and you're going to be precise and clear and unshakable. And anyone in that room with eyes and ears is going to know within 5 minutes that the woman in the chair is telling the truth. Clara was quiet for a moment. You have a lot of confidence in me, she said. I have an accurate assessment of you, he said, which amounts to the same thing. She laughed, a small, brief, real laugh, and then it faded and she was quiet again. What happens after? She said. After the judge, after the testimony, after all of it. What happens to you? He looked at the valley. Same as always, mountain. And the cabin. And the cabin. A pause. You don't have to go back to being alone, she said. Carefully. Not a request. A statement, offered without pressure, laid on the porch between them like something she was willing to leave there, whether he picked it up or not. Ethan looked at the lights in the valley below for a long time. No, he said finally. Reckon I don't. She didn't say anything else. She sat there on the porch step beside him and looked at the valley, and the mountain was quiet all around them. And somewhere down in Red Hollow, a man named Nathaniel Crow was pacing his study in the dark. And tomorrow, the judge was coming. And everything that had been building since a wounded woman rode out of the darkness on an exhausted horse and knocked on a stranger's door was about to come to a head in the only way it could, loudly, publicly, and in the full and unforgiving light of day. The night was long, but morning was coming, and Clara Whitfield was not afraid of the morning. Judge Harlan Pruitt arrived in Red Hollow on a Tuesday morning, and he arrived the way honest men in this territory tended to arrive, without fanfare, without a retinue, without any of the performance that powerful men usually felt entitled to. He rode in on a gray horse, tied it himself at the post in front of the county building, and walked inside carrying his own saddlebag. Ethan watched him from across the street. He'd asked around about Pruitt before trusting the man with something this consequential. 3 sources, as he'd told Clara. A ranch foreman in Deer Lodge, who'd been on the right side of a land dispute Pruitt had adjudicated in '81, a lawyer in Helena who'd opposed Pruitt twice and lost both times and respected him for it, and an old Nez Perce man who traded horses in the Missoula Valley and said simply that Pruitt was one of the few white men in a courtroom he'd ever seen actually listen. 3 sources, no overlap between them, no reason to coordinate. That was as close to certain as character assessment got. Pruitt was in his 60s, lean and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending decades in a territory that did not make accommodation for comfort. He had an air about him that was not precisely warm, but was completely without pretension, which Ethan had found over the years was more useful than warmth. Gareth Cole, the lawyer from Missoula, was already inside the county building when Ethan came in 20 minutes later. Cole was a compact man in his 40s, with quick, precise eyes, and the particular energy of someone who was most alive when there was an argument to be made. He'd spent the previous night at Pembroke's farm, going through every document in the folder Fenn had brought, and when Ethan had looked in on him at 10 o'clock, he'd been making notes in the margins with the focused absorption of a man who had found something he considered genuinely interesting. "This is solid," Cole had said, without looking up. "The ledger copies are damning. The Hatchet statement is corroborating. The Selby records." He'd shaken his head. "If even half the people on that list show up and say what they've said privately, Crow is finished." "And Clara?" Ethan had asked. Cole had put down his pen at that and looked up. "Miss Whitfield is going to be the center of this case and the most important person in that room, and I need her to understand that his lawyer, man named Stokes, I know his work, is going to try to reduce her. He's going to try to make her small and confused and unreliable in front of the judge." Cole had held Ethan's gaze. "She needs to be the opposite of that." "She will be," Ethan had said. "You're certain?" "More certain of that than anything else in this case." Cole had looked at him for a moment with a slightly different expression, and then had gone back to his notes. Now, the morning of the hearing, Ethan sat in the back of the county building and watched people file in, and the number of them was not what he'd expected. Not a few curious townspeople. The room was filling. Farmers and shopkeepers and women who usually made themselves invisible in public spaces. All of them finding seats or standing against the walls with the deliberate quiet of people who had decided to be somewhere important and were not going to be moved. Elias Pembroke was in the 3rd row with his son Jeremiah, who had apparently decided that being useful required his physical presence at the hearing, and had, Ethan gathered, made this argument to his father with some force. Dora Selby was in the 2nd row, wearing what was clearly her best dress, holding a Bible in her lap that was not, this time, hollowed out. She'd brought the real one. She sat with her hands folded on top of it and her back straight, and an expression that was the farthest thing from frightened that Ethan had seen in a long time. Rebecca Marsh had arrived the night before on the evening stage from Helena, a young woman with a composed face and steady hands who had shaken Ethan's hand and said, "I want to see the evidence before I go in. I want to know exactly what we have." He'd shown her everything, and she'd read through it without rushing, and at the end she'd said, "Good, that's enough. That's more than enough." And then she'd sat down at Pembroke's kitchen table and eaten 2 bowls of stew, because she was a practical woman who understood that testimony was physically demanding and she needed fuel for it. Crow came in 10 minutes before the proceeding began. He came in the way. Powerful men entered rooms they considered theirs. Unhurried, flanked, with the practiced ease of a man who had never once in his life been the smallest person in any space he occupied. He was well-dressed, silver-haired, with a face that in other contexts might have been called distinguished. He had with him his lawyer Stokes, a tall, oil-smooth man from Butte, who was known for making witnesses feel foolish, and 2 associates who were there, Ethan recognized, entirely for the purpose of visually communicating that Crow had resources. Crow swept the room with his gaze as he sat down. His eyes found Ethan. Ethan looked back at him, steady and expressionless. Crow's eyes moved on. They found Dora Selby, and something moved through his expression. A flicker of something that was not quite surprise and not quite fear, but was the beginning of both. Then they moved to Elias Pembroke, and the flicker deepened. Then they moved to the front of the room, where Cole was arranging documents, and Crow said something quietly to Stokes, and Stokes's composed face did something brief and involuntary before it reassembled itself. And then Crow turned and looked toward the side door, and Clara Whitfield walked into the room. She wore a dress that Mrs. Pembroke had lent her, dark blue, carefully pressed, and her dark hair was pinned back with the precision of someone who had decided exactly how she wanted to present herself and had executed it deliberately. The bruises on her face had faded in the weeks since she'd arrived at the cabin, but they had not disappeared entirely. There was still a faint shadow at her jaw, still a discoloration along her left cheekbone that no amount of time had yet erased completely. She walked to her seat with her head up and her hands steady, and she did not look at Nathaniel Crow. Ethan watched Crow watch her. Watched Crow's composed face work through something complicated and not entirely controlled. Because whatever Crow had expected, a frightened woman, a broken woman, a woman who could be made to seem unreliable in front of a judge, it was not this. This was not the Clara Whitfield who had worked in his kitchen for 2 years and learned to make herself invisible. This was a woman who had spent 3 weeks on a mountain, organizing evidence and writing statements and teaching a teenage boy to cook and deciding exactly who she was, and the difference was visible from across the room. Crow looked away first. Judge Pruitt called the proceeding to order at 9 o'clock precisely, and his voice was dry and businesslike, and contained not a syllable of ceremony beyond what the law required. "This is an informal hearing under territorial jurisdiction," he said. "I am reviewing a formal complaint filed by Mr. Gareth Cole on behalf of multiple complainants against Mr. Nathaniel Crow of Red Hollow, alleging assault, coercion, corruption of a public official, and land fraud. This is not a trial. It is a hearing to determine whether there is sufficient cause to refer this matter to the territorial court in Helena." He looked at both tables. "Mr. Cole, Mr. Stokes, we will proceed." Cole stood. He was organized and methodical and made no attempt at drama, which was itself a kind of drama. He laid out the structure of the case in 7 minutes without flourish, walking Pruitt through the categories of evidence: the ledger copies, the witness accounts, the hatchet statement, the documentation from Fenn, with the steady, unhurried confidence of a man who knew that what he had was enough and didn't need to oversell it. Stokes objected twice in those 7 minutes. Both objections were overruled. Then Cole said, "I'd like to call Miss Clara Whitfield." The room went very still. Clara stood. She walked to the chair that had been placed facing Pruitt's table. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. And Nathaniel Crow, for the first time in Ethan Walker's observation of him, was the smallest person in the room. Cole began with the straightforward questions: who she was, how long she had worked at the Crow Ranch, in what capacity. Clara answered clearly and precisely, her voice carrying to the back of the room without effort. Then he asked her to describe the evening 6 months ago when Crow first came to her room. She described it. She described it without embellishment and without evasion, and without the careful hedging that people who haven't decided what they're willing to say fall back on. She described it the way she described numbers, accurately, completely, with the calm of a person who has looked at a thing so many times that the looking no longer destroys her. She described the locked door and the sound of his voice and what he said and what happened after and how she felt when it was done and how she got up off the floor and went back to her room and sat in the dark until morning and then got up and made breakfast for the household because she did not yet understand that she had any other option. The room was absolutely silent. Even Stokes was not writing anything. He was sitting very still with his pen in his hand and nothing happening with it. Pruitt was watching Clara with the quality of attention that Ethan recognized from what the horse trader had told him. The quality of a man who was actually listening. Crow had stopped looking at the room entirely. He was looking at the table in front of him with the fixed expression of a man who had decided that if he did not look at what was happening, it was not happening. Cole let the silence sit for exactly the right amount of time. Then he said, "Miss Whitfield, I want to ask you about the ledger." And Clara Whitfield, who remembered every number she had ever seen, began to recite. She did not refer to notes. She did not look at the copies Cole had placed on the table. She looked at Judge Pruitt, and she recited dates and amounts and column headings from a ledger she had seen for 30 seconds, 18 months ago, from memory, with the steady precision of a woman who had been carrying that information for a long time and had been waiting for exactly this room to put it down in. There was a sound from Stokes's chair. A small, involuntary sound. Not a word. Just the sound a very good lawyer made when he understood that the case he'd prepared for was not the case he was actually in. Crow reached out and grabbed Stokes's forearm. Stokes leaned over and they exchanged rapid, quiet words. Pruitt said, without looking up from the notes he was taking, "Mr. Stokes, your client will refrain from distracting these proceedings." Stokes straightened. Crow's hand dropped. Cole finished with Clara. He thanked her. She sat very still for a second, and then she nodded once, and the nod was not for Cole, or for Pruitt, or for the room. It was for herself. It was a woman telling herself she'd done the thing. Then Stokes stood up. Howe was smooth, and he was prepared, and he started from exactly where Ethan had expected. Clara's character, her reliability, her motivations, the possibility of misremembrance, or misinterpretation, or the particular fragility of a woman scorned. He got about 4 minutes into it before Clara stopped him. Not rudely, not loudly. She simply said, "I'd like to address that." Stokes paused. "The column heading," Clara said, her voice clear and calm. "On the 3rd page of the document, Mr. Cole submitted, you've suggested the payments might represent legitimate ranch operating expenses. The column heading reads, Community Relations, and it appears in a section of the ledger that also contains personal household expenditures, not business operations. The payments to the business accounts are in the section that begins on page 7. The payment to Briggs is in the personal section, appearing between an entry for Mrs. Crow's millinery expenses and an entry for a Christmas gift to Mr. Crow's brother in St. Louis." She paused. "Would you like me to give you the amounts of those adjacent entries as well?" Silence. Someone in the room, Ethan didn't see who, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one. Stokes said, "That won't be necessary." "All right," Clara said. He tried 3 more angles. She met each one with the same quality. Not combative, not emotional, simply precise. She answered every challenge with information, and when there was no information to offer, she said clearly that she didn't know, and when Stokes pushed beyond his evidence, she said equally clearly that he was asking her to speculate, and she didn't do that. After the 3rd attempt, Stokes sat down. He said something to Crow. Crow said something back. They were quiet enough that the words didn't carry, but the body language carried. The specific, appalling language of 2 men who were sitting with the realization that the shape of this day was not the shape they had planned for. Dora Selby testified next. She stood up in the 2nd row without being called, before Cole even had a chance to speak, and said, in a voice that rang off the back wall, "I believe I'm next." Cole looked at her and then at Pruitt, and then said, "Yes, ma'am, if you'd like to take the chair." She walked to the chair with her real Bible under her arm, and she sat down, and she looked at Judge Pruitt and she said, "I have kept a record for 12 years. I have 7 names. I have dates. I have physical descriptions of injuries I personally witnessed, and in 2 cases assisted in treating. I have the name of the doctor who treated one of those women and declined to report what he had clearly seen because he was afraid of Nathaniel Crow. And I have a letter that doctor wrote to me 6 months ago saying he was sorry, and that if anyone ever asked him, he would tell the truth." She reached into the hollowed-out Bible, the old one, the one with the notebook, and produced a small, dense book covered in neat handwriting. "I am ready to go through it entry by entry if the judge requires." Pruitt looked at her for a moment. "Your name, ma'am," he said. "Dora Selby. I run the laundry on Main Street. I have lived in Red Hollow for 17 years. She looked back at him steadily. "I should have done this 12 years ago." "You're doing it now," Pruitt said. "Yes, sir, I am." She went through the notebook. Every entry, every name, every date, every description. She did it in the same voice she'd probably used to list laundry orders her entire life. Steady and without decoration. Because the facts themselves were decoration enough. And Dora Selby had apparently decided at some point that when you carried something terrible for a long time, the best thing you could do when you finally set it down was set it down completely. When she was done, Stokes made a perfunctory attempt at cross-examination that lasted less than 3 minutes before he evidently decided he was making things worse for himself and sat back down. Ethan watched Crow during Dora Selby's testimony. He watched a man who had built an identity on being untouchable sit in a chair in his own town and hear 12 years of his history laid out in a woman's handwriting. And the thing that Ethan saw in Crow's face was not shame. He had not, in his experience, found men of Crow's type capable of shame, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked more like the particular horror of a man who had simply never once imagined this specific moment was possible. He had bought himself a reality in which this could not happen, and it was happening. Aldous Fenn testified after Selby. He was meticulous and precise, and referred to specific line items in the copies of his documents with a bookkeeper's trained specificity. And when Stokes challenged the chain of custody of the documents, Fenn produced a notarized letter he had sent to himself via the Missoula post office the week after he left Crow's employ, a sealed letter, never opened, with the postmark clear, which contained a summary of the ledger entries he had seen. Cole held it up so Pruitt could see it, and the judge examined the postmark and the seal and set it down. Stokes didn't challenge the documents again. Then came Cole Hatchett. He walked in through the side door. Ethan had arranged this so that Crow would not see him until he was already in the room. And when Crow turned and saw his foreman of 12 years sitting down in the chair facing Judge Pruitt, something happened to Crow's face that was the closest thing to unguarded that Ethan had seen from him all morning. "You," Crow said. He said it out loud, involuntarily, in the voice of a man who had not meant to speak but couldn't stop it. Pruitt looked at him sharply. "Mr. Crow," he said, "you will not speak again unless you are invited to. Are we clear?" Crow pressed his lips together. His hands on the table in front of him were gripping each other with a white-knuckled force that the gesture was not quite controlled enough to hide. Hatchett testified about Alice Pryor. He testified about the $300, about the arrangement, about his own role in facilitating the payment and escorting the woman to the stage. His voice was flat and without excuse, the voice of a man who had stopped explaining himself because he understood that explanation was not what the moment required, only truth. At one point, Stokes asked him, "And why, Mr. Hatchett, did you not come forward with this information at the time?" Hatchett was quiet for a second. "Because I was a coward," he said, "and because I worked for a man who made cowardice easy." The room was very still. Then Stokes said, "And your motivation for coming forward now?" "The same reason most men do the right thing eventually," Hatchett said, "because the wrong thing got heavier than I could carry." Rebecca Marsh was last. She came in from the side door as Hatchett left, and she was composed and young and carried herself with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time preparing for a hard thing and has arrived at the moment so thoroughly ready that the readiness has replaced the fear. She sat down. She stated her name. She said when she had worked at the Crow Ranch and in what capacity, and when she had left. She said why she had left. She said it clearly and specifically, and then she said one additional thing that Ethan had not known she planned to say. "I have a daughter," she said. "She's 2 years old. Her name is Alice. I named her after the woman who worked at that ranch before me and left the same way I did, and who I never met, but who I have thought about almost every day since I understood what happened to her." She paused. "I named her Alice because I wanted to remember that I was not the first, and because I wanted Alice, my Alice, to know when she's old enough to understand it, that her name is a promise. That what happened to me and to the other Alice and to Clara Whitfield and to the women in Dora Selby's notebook, that it stopped here. That we came to a room and we said it out loud and we made it stop." The room was completely quiet. Not the held breath quiet of earlier. Something different. Something that felt less like tension and more like the collective exhale of a space full of people who had been carrying something heavy and were in the moment of setting it down. Stokes did not attempt to cross-examine Rebecca Marsh. Pruitt looked at him. "Mr. Stokes?" "No questions," Stokes said. His voice was controlled and professional and entirely without inflection, which was itself a kind of admission. Pruitt made a note. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his pen and looked across the room at Nathaniel Crow. "Mr. Crow," he said, "I'm going to give your counsel the opportunity to respond to the evidence and testimony presented this morning, and then I am going to tell you what I've decided." He paused. "Mr. Stokes, you may proceed." Stokes stood. He was composed and organized, and he argued skillfully for 20 minutes, challenging the chain of evidence, questioning the reliability of witnesses who had waited years to speak, characterizing the case as a coordinated effort to destroy a prominent man's reputation for personal and financial motives. It was a well-made argument. It was not, Ethan judged, good enough. When Stokes sat down, Pruitt was quiet for a long time. He looked at his notes. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Clara, who was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and at Dora Selby, who was still holding her notebook, and at Rebecca Marsh, who was looking at the wall with an expression of profound and exhausted calm. Then he looked at Nathaniel Crow. "Mr. Crow," he said, "I have been a circuit judge in this territory for 19 years. In that time I have heard a great deal of testimony and examined a great deal of evidence, and I have developed a reasonable capacity to distinguish between the weight of what I am given." He paused. "The evidence and testimony presented this morning is of exceptional weight. The corroboration across independent witnesses is, in my professional assessment, extraordinary. The documentary evidence has not been meaningfully challenged." He looked at his notes. "I am referring this matter to the Territorial Court in Helena. I am also, as of this moment, suspending Sheriff Briggs from his duties, pending investigation of the charges related to his office, and I am recommending to the Territorial Authority that a temporary marshal be appointed to Red Hollow immediately." A sound went through the room. Not dramatic, just a collective shift, a breath, a settling. "Mr. Crow," Pruitt continued, "you will remain in Red Hollow pending further instruction from the Territorial Court. Your assets are frozen effective immediately. Mr. Stokes, you will make sure your client understands what that means." He stood. "We're adjourned." The room moved. It moved the way rooms moved after long compressed things were released. Not in an explosion, but in a quiet, unstoppable spreading, like water through cracked ground. People stood and turned to each other, and the sound of voices began to build, and somewhere in the middle of it, Ethan Walker stood up from his seat at the back of the room and looked toward the chair where Clara Whitfield was sitting. She hadn't moved yet. She was sitting exactly where she had been when Pruitt adjourned, with her hands still folded in her lap, and her head was bent slightly forward, and Ethan thought for a second that she might be crying. He moved through the room toward her. He reached her and crouched down so he was at eye level with her, and she looked up, and she was not crying. Her eyes were dry and clear, and she was looking at him with an expression that he could not immediately name. Something between enormous relief and a kind of careful wonder. The expression of a person who has spent so long believing a thing was impossible that they are still, in the first moments of it having happened, working through the adjustment. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, and she pressed her lips together for a second. "Ethan." "Yeah." "My hands aren't shaking," she said. He looked at her hands, still folded in her lap, completely still. "No," he said. "They're not." She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked back up at him, and something in her face shifted. A releasing, like a key being turned in a lock that had been rusted shut for a long time. "I want to go home," she said. He didn't ask which home she meant. He stood up and held out his hand, and she took it and stood up. And he did not let go of her hand as they walked together toward the door of the county building and out into the light. Behind them, Nathaniel Crow sat at his table with his lawyer's hand on his arm, and his face the face of a man who had spent 50 years in this valley being everything, and was only now, in this room, in this moment, beginning to understand what nothing felt like. Dora Selby walked past him on her way out. She didn't look at him. She tucked her notebook under her arm and walked out of that building without once turning her head toward the man who had made it necessary. Because Dora Selby had spent 12 years thinking about Nathaniel Crow, and she had decided she was finished. Outside, in the sunlight, Rebecca Marsh was talking to Elias Pembroke, and Jeremiah was standing nearby looking like a young man who had just seen something he was going to carry with him for the rest of his life. And Gareth Cole was making notes with the absorbed energy of a man who had already moved on to the next strategic question. And Aldous Fenn was standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, with the expression of a man who had not slept a full night in 18 months and was beginning to understand that he might, tonight, sleep. Clara stood in the light outside the courthouse with her face turned up slightly, and Ethan stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Dora Selby came up behind them and put one hand on Clara's shoulder, just briefly, just firmly, and said, "Well done, child," and kept walking. Clara closed her eyes. Just for a second, just long enough to feel it. Then she opened them. The days after the hearing moved differently than the days before it. That was the only way Ethan could describe it to himself, riding back up the mountain that afternoon with Clara beside him on the borrowed Pembroke horse. Something in the quality of the air had changed. The way air changed after a long storm finally broke. Not peaceful, exactly. There was still too much unfinished for peace. But different. Breathable in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Clara was quiet on the ride up. Not the careful quiet of someone managing fear, but the quiet of someone whose mind was moving fast through a lot of territory, and didn't need words for it yet. Ethan gave her the silence. He'd learned in the past 3 weeks which of her silences needed filling and which ones needed leaving alone, and this one needed leaving alone. They were halfway up the trail when she said, without preamble, "Briggs is going to say he was coerced." "Probably. How wasn't? He took the money voluntarily for 9 years. "He did. And Fenn's documents show the pattern clearly enough that voluntary is the only reasonable interpretation." Ethan guided his horse around a loose rock on the trail. "Pruitt saw it." "Pruitt saw everything," Clara said. There was something in her voice when she said it. Not relief. Something more complicated than relief. The particular quality of a person who has spent a long time not being believed, and is still in the early stages of adjusting to the fact of being believed now. "He did," Ethan said. She was quiet for another stretch. Then, "Rebecca Marsh is staying in Red Hollow for 2 weeks. She told me before we left. She said she wants to walk through that town and not hide, just once, before she goes back to Helena." "Good." Dora Selby said she's going to name the laundry. Clara turned slightly in the saddle to look at him. "She's been running it for 17 years without a name. Just the laundry on Main Street. She said she's going to put a sign up. Said she's earned the right to have her name on something in this town." Something moved through Ethan's chest, quiet and sure. "Dora Selby's laundry," he said. "That's what she said." Clara turned back to the trail. "I want to be there when she puts the sign up." They reached the cabin as the last light was going gold above the tree line, and Jeremiah Pembroke's horse was already gone from the barn. The boy had headed back down to his father's farm from the courthouse, and the cabin was quiet and still and entirely itself. The way it was always entirely itself, indifferent to what had or hadn't happened below in the valley. Clara went inside, and Ethan saw to the horses, and when he came in, she had the fire going and was standing at the stove with her sleeves rolled up and the cast-iron skillet in her hand, and the sight of her standing in his kitchen like that, with the fire going and the light moving over her face, and the skillet that she'd once considered using as a weapon now being used for its intended purpose, landed somewhere in him with a weight he wasn't quite ready to name. "Sit down," she said, without turning around. "I'm cooking." He sat. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She set the skillet on the fire. "I want to. I haven't cooked because I wanted to in a long time." A pause. Cooking for someone who deserves it is different from cooking because you have to. Ethan sat at the table and did not say anything, and watched her move around his kitchen with the ease of someone who had learned the space and made it her own, and thought about deserving things, and thought about the specific and surprising quality of the last 3 weeks, and thought about what she'd said on the porch. "You don't have to go back to being alone." And the answer he'd given, which had been true when he said it, and was more true now. She set a plate in front of him. "Eat," she said. He ate. She sat across from him and ate too, and the fire made the only sound in the cabin for a while. and it was the most comfortable silence Ethan Walker had sat in for 15 years, maybe longer. "What happens next?" she said finally. "With the territorial court, timeline, back to business." He'd learned that about her too. The way she used practical questions to hold herself together when the emotional weight of something got too heavy to carry directly. He met her where she was. "Cole thinks 6 to 8 weeks before the formal proceedings in Helena," he said. "Crow's assets are frozen, which means his lawyers are working on a retainer that already existed, not new money, which limits what Stokes can do. Cole considers that significant." He picked up his coffee. "Rebecca and Dora will both need to go to Helena when the time comes. Fen is already there. You'll need to go." "I know. Cole will prepare you. He's good at that. The preparation. He thinks you're—" He paused. "What does he think?" "He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that you were the finest witness he had ever put in front of a judge." Clara looked at her plate for a second. "He's being generous," she said. "He's being accurate," Ethan said. "Cole doesn't do generous. It's not in his professional vocabulary." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't feel fine. I felt—" She stopped, started again. "I felt like the whole room was watching me decide who I was going to be. Like everything depended on whether I could stay in my own body through it. And you did." "I did." She looked up. "You were in the back of the room the whole time." "I was. I couldn't see you, but I knew you were there." He held her gaze. "That mattered," she said simply. Not making more of it than it was. Just saying the true thing. "Good," he said. She picked up her fork again. Outside, the mountain was settling into its night sounds. The wind in the pines, the creek running somewhere below, an owl announcing itself in the dark. The sounds that Ethan had fallen asleep to for 15 years, and that he realized, hearing differently now. Not as the sounds of solitude, as the sounds of a place that had, without any ceremony, become something more than solitude. The next morning, Ethan rode down to the valley alone, not to town, just to the edge of his property, where the trail leveled out and you could see Red Hollow spread below. He sat on his horse and looked at it for a long time, the way he had looked at it 3 weeks ago when he'd gone to the edge and decided something. The difference this time was that the thing he'd decided had been decided, and the town below was the same town in all its ordinary dimensions, but tilted slightly, reorganized around a new fact. Briggs's office was empty, the temporary marshal having arrived from Missoula the previous evening. Crow's land office had its shutters pulled. The general store with Crow's name above the door was open, because the man who ran it for Crow had a family to feed, and the store itself had done nothing wrong, and Red Hollow needed a general store. The town was the same, and not the same. That was how it went, Ethan thought. You didn't burn a thing down and build something new. You worked in the existing structure, and you changed what was rotten, and you kept what was sound, and eventually the thing you had was different from what you'd started with, even if it looked similar from the outside. He turned his horse and rode back up. Clara was at the table when he came in, writing. She'd been writing a lot in the days since the hearing. Not testimony, something different. She covered the papers with her hand when he came in, not furtively, just automatically, and he didn't ask. "Pembroke sent word," she said. "Jeremiah rode up this morning while you were out. Dora Selby is putting the sign up this afternoon. She wants us there." "We'll go," Ethan said. She nodded and went back to her writing, and he went to the barn to check on the horses. And when he came back, she was still writing, and there was something on her face, focused and quiet and entirely her own, that he recognized as the expression of a woman who was doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, in exactly the space she needed to do it in. He did not interrupt her. At 2 p.m, they rode down to Red Hollow together. Dora Selby had painted the sign herself. It was not elaborate. Dark letters on a pale board, straightforward and clear. Selby's Laundry. She'd had Elias Pembroke nail the bracket to the wall above her door, and when Ethan and Clara arrived, a small collection of townspeople had already gathered in front of the building without any formal announcement, the way communities sometimes gathered for things that mattered without being told that they mattered. Dora stood in front of her door with the sign in her hands and looked at the assembled faces. Pembroke and his son, Rebecca Marsh, the doctor who had written the letter of apology and had the grace to show his face here today. 3 women who had been on the periphery of the whole proceedings, and who, Ethan gathered from the way they stood near Dora, had known her for a long time and owed her various kinds of debt. And Clara, who stood at the edge of the small crowd with her hands at her sides and watched Dora Selby with an expression of open, uncomplicated admiration. Dora looked at the sign for a moment. Then she said, "I've been running this laundry for 17 years, and I never put my name on it because I was afraid that a man in this town would make me regret it." She paused. "I am done being afraid of that man." She looked at Pembroke. "Elias." Pembroke climbed the short ladder and took the sign and fitted it into the bracket and drove the nail, and it went up level and straight with the particular solidity of something that intended to stay. Dora Selby looked at her name on the side of her building. Nobody clapped. Nobody said anything ceremonial. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter and more real than that. A group of people standing in the afternoon light, watching a woman look at her own name on the wall of a thing she'd built, and understanding without words what it meant that it was there now. Then Dora turned and looked directly at Clara. "Come have coffee," she said. "You and Walker both. I've got pie." They had pie. They sat in Dora Selby's back room. Dora and Clara and Ethan and Rebecca Marsh and Elias Pembroke and Jeremiah, who was always where the action was now and had apparently decided that this qualified. And they drank coffee and ate pie and talked about ordinary things for a while, the way people did after extraordinary things, because ordinary things were what proved you were still there. Jeremiah told them about a calf that had been born at the farm 2 nights ago with a white mark on its forehead, in the shape of something that he claimed was a cross, and his father said was a splash. Rebecca Marsh said she'd been looking at a small house in Helena near her sister's and was considering whether she could afford it. Dora said the pie was apple because she'd had apples going soft in her larder and it seemed a shame to waste them. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, Clara looked at Ethan across the table, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed saying that wasn't already being said by the fact of the 2 of them sitting at that table with these people, in this town, at this moment. It was the most ordinary afternoon Ethan Walker had spent in a long time. It was also, he thought, one of the best. 3 days later, the letter came. It came via a rider from Missoula, addressed to Clara Whitfield in care of the Walker property, and Ethan brought it to her without looking at it, which she noticed and which she appreciated in the particular quiet way she appreciated most of the things he did. She opened it. She read it. She set it on the table. "Well," Ethan said, "it's from Gareth Cole." She pressed her lips together for a second. Crow's legal team in Helena filed a motion to have the case dismissed on jurisdictional grounds. They're arguing that the hearing wasn't properly convened under territorial law. She paused. "Cole says it's a delay tactic. Standard. He's already filed the response." She looked up. "He also says that 2 additional women have come forward in Helena, women who left Red Hollow in the past decade. He doesn't know yet whether they'll testify, but they've made contact." Ethan looked at her. "2 more," she said. "Crow had a long reach," he said, "and a long history." She picked up the letter again and read the last paragraph. "Cole says, he says to tell you that the jurisdictional motion will be denied, and that he has argued in front of the Helena court before, and he knows what he's walking into, and that he considers the outcome of the territorial trial about as certain as outcomes in law ever get." She set the letter down. "He's confident." "Cole earned his confidence," Ethan said. "He's careful about what he claims." Clara nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I've been writing something." "I know." She looked up. "You cover it when I come in," he said. "Which is fine. Just telling you I noticed." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she reached across the table and picked up the stack of papers she'd been accumulating over the past week and set them in front of him. He looked at them. It was a proposal. Carefully organized, meticulously written, covering 3 pages in her precise, small handwriting. A proposal for a boarding house. The plan she'd had when she came to Red Hollow 2 years ago. The one she'd set aside, and that Ethan had told her on the first night wasn't dead. But it was different from what she'd originally planned. Bigger. And specific to something she'd identified in the past 3 weeks. The proposal outlined a boarding house in Red Hollow that would serve, in addition to regular paying guests, as a reliable and private place for women in situations like hers. Women who needed somewhere to go that wasn't defined by whoever they were running from. Not a charity. A business, run on business principles, with a small separate fund established from a portion of the proceeds that would allow for reduced rates in cases of genuine need. She'd done the accounting. Occupancy projections, operating costs, establishment costs, expected revenue by month for the first 2 years. All of it, laid out with the thoroughness of a woman who had run a household and kept books since she was 12 years old. Ethan read every page. When he finished, he set the papers down. "There's a building on Clearwater Street," he said. 2-story. It was a hotel for about a year in 78 and 80 before the owner went back east. It's been sitting empty since. The county took it for unpaid taxes in 82. He paused. "I know the county assessor. The new one, not the one Crow was paying." He met her eyes. "It might be available." Clara stared at him. "You know the assessor," she said. "I know most people in this territory, one way or another. I've been here a long time." He tapped the proposal. "This is a good plan." "It's a real plan," she said. "It needs capital." "How much?" She told him the number. I was quiet for a moment. "I have some savings. Not everything you need, but a beginning." "Ethan, it's an investment," he said. "In a good plan run by a person I trust completely. That's not charity, that's judgment." He held her gaze. "And before you argue with me, I want you to think about whether you would turn down investment capital from Gareth Cole or Elias Pembroke. And if the answer is no, then consider why the answer would be different with me." She looked at him steadily. "Because Gareth Cole and Elias Pembroke are not—" She stopped. "Not what?" he said. She pressed her lips together. A long pause. And then, with the same quality she brought to everything, direct, honest, without unnecessary decoration, she said, "Not someone I'm in danger of caring about too much." The cabin was very quiet. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "That right," he said. "That's what I said." "Is it a problem?" he said. "The caring about." She thought about it. He could see her thinking about it, turning it over with the same thoroughness she applied to accounting, which was, he thought, both exactly who she was and exactly what he wanted her to be. "No," she said finally. "I don't think so. I think it might be the least problematic thing in my life right now, which is saying something given the last 6 months." She looked at her proposal on the table between them. "I think it might actually be the most solid thing I have." Ethan was quiet for a second. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. Neither of them said anything more for a moment. Neither of them needed to. There was a particular kind of understanding between people who had been through something hard together, a shorthand that didn't require words, a knowledge of each other that had been built not in moments of comfort, but in moments of pressure, which was the only kind of knowledge that held when tested. He picked up her proposal and squared the pages and set them back on the table in front of her. "Talk to the assessor this week," he said, "about the Clearwater building. Will you come with me?" "If you want me to." "I want you to," she said, simply, without qualifying it. "Then I'll come," he said. The territorial trial in Helena happened 6 weeks later, and it went the way Gareth Cole had said it would go, which was to say, it went the way it had to go, given the weight and volume and meticulous organization of the evidence, given the 7 witnesses who stood up in a Helena courtroom and said what they knew in voices that did not shake, given the 2 additional women from Crow's history who had, in the end, decided to testify, and who did so with a quiet courage that Cole said afterward he had seldom seen in 30 years of practice. Nathaniel Crow was convicted on 4 counts: assault, corruption of a public official, land fraud, and witness intimidation. The last for the letter he'd sent to Clara at Ethan's property line, which had been exactly the evidence it appeared to be. His assets were forfeited, the ranch to be managed by a court-appointed receiver pending sale, the proceeds to be distributed according to a formula that included restitution payments to the documented victims. Briggs received 2 years and a permanent bar from public office. Cole shook Clara's hand outside the Helena courthouse and told her she'd been the finest witness in the finest case he'd expected ever to argue, and that if she ever had use for a lawyer in whatever she was building next, he'd be pleased to hear from her at reduced rates. She thanked him. She was composed through all of it. Through the verdict, and through the sentencing, and through the procedural aftermath, she was composed and precise and exactly herself. And then they were outside, and Ethan was beside her, and the Helena street was loud and indifferent around them the way city streets were, and she turned to him and put her face against his chest and breathed. Just breathed. He put his arms around her and held her, and she breathed, and the city moved around them, and for a moment neither of them was a woman who had survived something terrible, or a man who had spent 15 years avoiding the world. They were just two people standing on a street in Helena, holding on to something real. Then she pulled back and straightened and looked up at him. "Ready to go home?" she said. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I am." The Clearwater Street building became, in the following spring, the Whitfield House. It took 4 months and more work than either of them had originally projected, because buildings that have sat empty for 6 years had opinions about renovation that were generally expensive, and Clara's standards for what a house that was going to serve as refuge for women in difficult circumstances ought to be were exacting and non-negotiable. It needed to feel like safety, she said. Not like charity. Not like a way station. Like a home. So that the women who came there understood from the moment they walked in that they deserved a home. Ethan built the shelves in the front room himself. He wasn't a cabinet maker by training, but he was a man who built things carefully and didn't leave until they were right. And Clara stood behind him at one point while he was working and said, "You're doing the corners twice." "I know. That's going to take longer." "Corners done right don't need redoing," he said. "Corners done fast do." She was quiet for a second. "That's true of more than shelves," she said. "Most things worth building," he agreed. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly, the way she touched things that mattered. Not dramatically, just honestly, and then went back to her accounts. Dora Selby was the first person Clara asked to be on the small board of advisors for the house's assistance fund. Dora said yes before Clara had finished the sentence, and brought to the role the same organized tenacity she'd brought to keeping records for 12 years, and the same conviction she'd brought to putting her name on her wall. Rebecca Marsh sent a letter from Helena saying she'd told 3 women she knew about the Whitfield house and that 2 of them had already written to Clara directly. Jeremiah Pembroke asked if he could help with the heavy work during the renovation and turned out to be a better carpenter than anyone had expected, which Clara said was unsurprising because he had clearly always had good hands and just needed someone to point them at the right thing. His father. Elias said he'd supply eggs and produce to the house at cost, because feeding people who needed feeding was one of the things a farm was for. And he said it the matter-of-fact way that Ethan had come to understand was how the best people in this territory operated. Like doing the right thing didn't require special credit, just the doing of it. Cole Hatchett came to Ethan 3 weeks after the Helena verdict and asked if there was work. He had resigned from Crow's Ranch the day of the Red Hollow hearing and had been doing odd jobs since. And he looked like a man who was in the early stages of building himself into someone different, and wasn't sure yet whether the lumber was going to hold. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "There's work at the Whitfield house," he said. "Hard work. Manual labor mostly. Renovation." He paused. "Clara makes the decision on who's on that property, not me." Hatchett nodded. "I'll ask her," he said. He asked her. She looked at him steadily for a long time, and then said that she would give him 1 week's work on a trial basis, and that she would form her own opinion on the question of trust, and that nobody's past was either a permanent credential or a permanent bar in her establishment, and that she expected anyone working on her property to understand that. He worked the week, then another. He was good with his hands, and he worked hard, and he did not, in Clara's assessment, require managing. He showed up and did the work without needing to be told he'd done it well, which she considered a significant indicator of character. She kept him on. Ethan spent most of his time between the cabin and the Whitfield house during those months, which meant he spent most of his time between the mountain and the valley, which meant he was no longer exactly a mountain man in the way he had been for 15 years, and no longer exactly a valley man, but something in between that didn't have a name yet and didn't need one. The cabin was still his. He still went up there. He still needed the mountain, the way some people needed silence. Not absence, just a particular quality of space. But he went up knowing he was coming back down, which was different from the way he'd lived before, when going up was the whole point and coming down was just errands. He came down for supper most evenings. That was how it settled. Not with declaration, not with conversation, just with the natural gravity of two people whose days had become organized around each other. He came down and she cooked, or he cooked, or they cooked together, and they sat at the table in the Whitfield house kitchen and talked about what needed doing the next day, and what Cole had said in his last letter, and what Dora had told her, and what Jeremiah had managed to accomplish with the east wall. Ordinary things, the best things. On the evening they opened the Whitfield house to its first guest, a young woman from a ranch outside Red Hollow, whose situation was not unlike Clara's had been, who arrived frightened and careful, and who Clara met at the door with the same quality of reception she herself had been given on a mountain in the dark, which was, "You're safe here." Ethan sat on the front steps of the house afterward and looked at the lights on Clearwater Street. Clara came out and sat beside him. "First night," she said. "How is she?" "Scared. Eating." A pause. "She'll be all right." Ethan nodded. They were quiet for a while. The street was doing its evening things. Someone walking a horse down to the livery. A lamp being lit in the window across the road. The ordinary acoustic of a small town settling into dark. "You know what I've been thinking about," Clara said. "Tell me." "That night on the mountain." She looked at the street. "I had no idea where I was going. I was just riding toward anywhere that wasn't there." She paused. "And I ended up at your door." "You did." "I've thought about that a lot. Whether it was luck. Whether things like that are luck." She turned and looked at him. "What do you think?" He considered it. He considered it the way he considered most things she asked, seriously, without rushing toward an answer that would be easier than a true one. "I think," he said, "that you were the kind of woman who was going to find a door eventually. Because you didn't stop. You rode in the dark and you kept going, and eventually there was a door." He paused. "I think I was just the door." "You were a great deal more than a door," she said. "Maybe." He looked at the street. "But I've been thinking about what I was before you knocked, and I think a door nobody walks through is just a wall." He paused. "You walked through. That mattered as much as anything I did." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached over and took his hand, and she held it the way she held things that mattered, simply, without ceremony, without making it more complicated than it was. His hand closed around hers. On the mountain above Red Hollow, the cabin sat in its clearing with the fire banked and the rifle on the wall, and the table where a woman had once spent 2 hours writing down numbers from a ledger she'd seen for 30 seconds, writing them down in precise and careful handwriting because she had survived long enough to need them to matter. Down in the valley, in a building on Clearwater Street with a sign above the door, a young woman sat in a room with a bolt on the inside and ate the first safe meal she'd had in months. And on the front steps of the Whitfield house, in the last light of an evening in the autumn of 1884, two people who had each spent a long time learning how to be alone sat together and did not let go. The mountain remained. The valley remained. The town of Red Hollow remained, reorganized around a new truth. That power borrowed from fear was not power at all. That silence could be broken by one person willing to speak. And that a door opened in the dark was the beginning of everything. Nathaniel Crow had believed he owned this valley. What he had never understood, and what the valley was only now learning to believe about itself, was that no man owned a place where women like Clara Whitfield decided to stand. She had arrived with bruises and a horse, and 20 years of surviving things that were supposed to stop her. She left nothing behind. She built everything forward. And in Red Hollow, Montana, in the year of 1884, that was enough to change the world that mattered. The one made of neighbors and doorways and names on walls, and the quiet radical act of one man choosing, at the edge of everything he'd withdrawn from, to open the door.